Most people think Alexander the Great wanted to rule the world. They're wrong. He didn't want the world. He wanted the feeling of winning it. Every time his father, Philip, captured a famous city, Alexander didn't celebrate. He looked at his friends with genuine dread and said, "Boys, my father will forestall me in everything. There will be nothing great or spectacular for you and me to show the world." This wasn't just a competitive kid. This was the birth of a psychological obsession so deep that it would eventually force him to lead an army across 11,000 miles of unknown territory until they reached the edge of the map and refused to go any further. History calls him a conqueror, but if we look at the scrolls of Plutarch, we see something different. A man who was a slave to his own greatness. We're going to look into the psychology of a mind that literally ran out of world to conquer. Why the most powerful man on earth felt like a failure every time he stopped moving. Before we continue, if you're here to master your mindset through philosophy and psychology, hit that subscribe button and join us. To understand why Alexander couldn't stop, we have to go back to the moment he realized that for him, the normal world was simply too small. Most of us view competition as a way to win a prize. Alexander viewed it as a way to prove he was fundamentally different from other men. His father, King Philip II, was a titan. He had turned Macedonia from a backwater into a superpower. For most sons, this is a legacy to inherit. For Alexander, it was a prison. He didn't just want to succeed his father, he wanted to render his father irrelevant. The defining moment of this obsession happened when he was only 14. A horse dealer brought Philip a stallion named Bucephalus. The horse was massive, beautiful, and completely wild. Philip's best grooms couldn't mount him. The king, frustrated, ordered the vicious animal to be led away. But Alexander saw what the veterans didn't. He noticed the horse wasn't angry. It was terrified. It was shying away from its own shadow. While the experts tried to use force, Alexander used psychology. He turned the horse toward the sun so it couldn't see its shadow, spoke softly, and vaulted onto its back. He didn't just tame a horse. He solved a puzzle that the most powerful men in Greece couldn't figure out. When he rode back, Philip wept, not out of pride, but out of a sudden, chilling realization. He told his son, "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedonia is too small for you." This is the exact moment the psychology of obsession took hold. Alexander realized that if he wanted to be satisfied, the known world would never be enough. He began to see his life not as a series of years, but as a series of obstacles to be overcome by sheer force of will and intellect. He wasn't training to be a king. He was training to be a god. And to do that, he needed a teacher who dealt in the absolute truths of the universe. Winning battles is one thing. Winning the argument of existence is another. Philip realized that his son didn't just need a general. He needed a mind that could map the universe. So, he sent for Aristotle, the most learned man of the age. Most students want to learn how to pass. Alexander wanted to learn how to transcend. Aristotle didn't just teach him politics and ethics. He initiated him into secret and esoteric studies, the kind of knowledge that philosophers usually kept from the public. This is where Alexander's obsession took a chilling turn toward exclusivity. Years later, when he found out Aristotle had published some of these doctrines in a book, Alexander didn't congratulate his mentor. He sent him a blunt, angry letter. He wrote, "What advantage shall I have over other men if these theories, in which I have been trained, are to be made common property?" Think about that. His obsession wasn't just with having power, it was with having information that no one else possessed. He explicitly stated that he would rather excel the rest of mankind in my knowledge of what is best than in the extent of my power. For Alexander, knowledge was just another territory to be occupied and defended. This intellectual warfare even extended to his sleep. He famously slept with two things under his pillow: a dagger and a copy of the Iliad. He didn't see the poem as literature. He saw it as a handbook of the art of war. He was obsessed with Achilles, not as a hero to admire, but as a benchmark to surpass. He once said that while his father gave him life, it was Aristotle who taught him how to live well. But living well for Alexander didn't mean finding peace. It meant becoming a living myth. And once the student felt he had surpassed the master, he turned his eyes toward the only thing left to conquer, the vast, terrifying expanse of the Persian Empire. When Alexander finally turned his back on Macedonia to cross into Asia, he wasn't just starting a war, he was burning his bridges to the past. Before he even stepped onto a ship, he did something that most people would consider a psychological breakdown. He gave away almost everything the crown owned. He assigned estates to one friend, a village to another, and the revenues of ports to a third. Perdiccas, one of his officers, looked at him in total disbelief and asked, "Your Majesty, what are you leaving for yourself?" Alexander's answer was short, "My hopes." This is the peak of obsession. He didn't want the safety net of a kingdom to return to. He believed so completely in his future that the present was just currency he could spend to get there. He crossed the Hellespont with only 30 days of supplies and a massive amount of debt. To anyone else, this was a suicide mission. To Alexander, it was a necessary weight reduction. His first stop was Troy. He didn't go there for a history lesson. He went to the grave of Achilles, anointed the column with oil, and ran a race naked with his companions around it. He remarked that Achilles was lucky because he had found a faithful friend while he lived, and a great poet to sing of his deeds after his death. He wasn't just visiting a hero, he was measuring himself against a ghost. But the reality of war hit him at the river Granicus. The Persian generals were waiting on the opposite bank with a massive force. His own officers were terrified by the depth of the water and the muddy, treacherous slopes they would have to climb under a hail of missiles. Even Parmenio, his most experienced general, advised him to wait. Alexander's response was pure psychological warfare. He said the Hellespont would blush for shame if he shrank back from a mere stream. He plunged into the river with 13 squadrons of cavalry. It looked like the act of a desperate madman. He was easily recognizable by his shield and the 2 tall white plumes on his helmet, making him the primary target for every Persian spear. He nearly died when a Persian battle axe split his helmet and grazed his hair. He won. But he didn't win because he had more men. He won because he possessed a level of audacity that the Persians literally couldn't comprehend. But winning a battle is easy compared to what comes next: the burden of being a god. As Alexander moved deeper into Asia, he encountered a puzzle that perfectly illustrates the difference between a conqueror and an obsessed visionary: the Gordian knot. In the city of Gordium, there was an ancient chariot tied with a knot so complex that no one could find the ends of the cord. The legend was simple: whoever untied the knot was destined to rule the world. For centuries, the greatest minds and strongest men had tried and failed. They all played by the same rules. They tried to untangle it. When Alexander stood before it, he didn't try to play their game. He didn't have the patience for impossible. Most writers say he simply drew his sword and hacked through the cord in a single stroke. This is the psychology of a man who refuses to let tradition or difficulty dictate his pace. To Alexander, if the rules didn't lead to victory, the rules were wrong. He wasn't just solving a knot. He was announcing to the world that his path to power wouldn't follow anyone else's logic. But this obsession with destiny soon took a darker, more isolated turn. He began to believe his own myth. After his victory at Issus, he didn't just want the Persian Empire. He wanted the Persians to acknowledge he was fundamentally superior to them. He began to adopt their customs, their dress, and most controversially, he began to demand proskynesis, the act of prostrating oneself before a ruler as if they were a god. To his Macedonian veterans, this was a betrayal. They were free men who fought alongside a king, not slaves to a deity. But Alexander's obsession had moved past human companionship. He began to see his friends not as equals, but as tools. He famously said that Hephaestion was a friend of Alexander, while Craterus was a friend of the king. He was compartmentalizing his life, separating the man from the crown. And in doing so, he was becoming the loneliest man on earth. He was no longer fighting for Macedonia. He was fighting for a version of himself that didn't exist yet, a god-king of a unified world. And anyone who stood in the way of that vision, even his oldest friends, was about to find out how cold that obsession could be. Obsession doesn't just demand your time, it eventually demands your humanity. As Alexander's vision of himself as a god grew, his tolerance for human fallibility disappeared. The more he became the Great, the more he became a stranger to the men who had known him since he was a boy. The first major fracture happened with Philotas, the son of his top general, Parmenio. Philotas had become arrogant, boasting to his mistress that Alexander was just a mere boy who owed everything to his generals. When a real conspiracy against Alexander was discovered, Philotas failed to report it, twice. Alexander didn't just execute Philotas. He watched from behind a curtain as his friend was tortured. Then, he sent assassins to kill Parmenio, the man who had served his father and secured his own throne, simply because he couldn't risk the father's revenge for the son's death. This wasn't justice. It was a cold, calculated removal of a psychological threat. But the true breaking point of his soul came on a drunken night in Samarkand. Clytus, the man who had literally saved Alexander's life at the Granicus, had seen enough of the god-king persona. At a banquet, he snapped. He told Alexander to his face that his greatness was built on the blood of Macedonians, and that he should stop disowning his father, Philip. He mocked Alexander for needing to beg Persians for an audience with his own king. Alexander, blinded by a choleric rage he had possessed since childhood, snatched a spear and ran Clytus through. The moment the spear hit, the obsession broke, briefly. Alexander tried to kill himself with the same spear, but his guards stopped him. He spent the next 3 days in a dark room, sobbing in an agony of remorse. But here's the terrifying turn in his psychology. A philosopher named Anaxarchus came to his room and saw him weeping like a slave. He told Alexander, "Do you not know that Zeus has justice and law seated by his side to prove that everything that is done by the ruler of the world is lawful and just?" Instead of humbling Alexander, this argument cured his guilt by making him more autocratic than ever. He realized that if he were truly a god, he couldn't be wrong. With his conscience silenced, the obsession was now absolute. He turned his eyes toward India, the edge of the inhabited world. By the time Alexander reached India, he wasn't just looking for territory, he was looking for the end of the world. But in the jungles of the east, his obsession finally hit a wall that his sword couldn't cut through. During the battle against King Porus, Alexander fought in a violent storm, famously crying out, "O you Athenians, will you ever believe what risks I am running just to earn your praise?" Even at the edge of the known universe, he was still performing for an audience back home that he would never see again. When he reached the Hephaestus River, his men did something they had never done. They refused to move. They had heard rumors of massive armies and thousands of war elephants waiting for them across the Ganges. For the first time, Alexander's will was not enough to command reality. He shut himself in his tent, consumed by disappointment and anger, feeling that if he couldn't cross the river, his entire life's work was a defeat. This is the most dangerous stage of obsession. When the external world stops providing victories, the mind turns inward and becomes self-destructive. Searching for a way to prove his invincibility, he threw himself into a reckless assault against the Mali. He was the first to scale the wall, alone, and was shot through the chest with an arrow that measured 4 fingers wide. He survived, but he was no longer the same man. The final blow to his psyche wasn't a wound, but a loss. His closest friend, Hephaestion, died of a fever in Ecbatana. Alexander's grief was uncontrollable. He crucified the physician who couldn't save him, forbade music across the empire, and even massacred an entire tribe, the Kasaeans, calling it a sacrifice to Hephaestion's spirit. He was a god who couldn't save the one person he loved. When he finally retreated toward Babylon, the world itself seemed to warn him to stop. Ravens fell dead at his feet. A tame ass kicked a lion to death in his menagerie. A stranger was found sitting silently on his throne, wearing the royal diadem. His confidence deserted him, replaced by a superstition that saw every unusual event as a dark omen. In the end, it wasn't a Persian spear or an Indian elephant that killed him. It was a simple fever following a drinking party. Over 10 days, he slowly lost his strength, then his speech, and finally his life. Alexander the Great died at 32, having conquered everything but his own restless spirit. He left behind an empire that he hadn't even named an heir for, simply because he could never imagine a world that didn't belong to him. Alexander's life leaves us with a chilling realization. The more you conquer, the less you actually own. He had the finest education, the strongest army, and the greatest crown in history. Yet, he died in a strange bed in Babylon, surrounded by commanders who were already planning to tear his legacy apart. He had won every battle, but he lost the war against his own nature. The core of Alexander's obsession wasn't a desire to build. It was a desperate need to avoid being finished. He once said that sleep and sexual intercourse were the only things that reminded him he was mortal. He hated that reminder. He spent his entire life trying to prove he was the exception to the human condition, an outlier who could outrun fate itself. But the rules of reality are indifferent to titles. Alexander found a kingdom big enough for his ambitions, but he never found a version of himself that was satisfied with what he already held. He was a man who could untie the Gordian knot and cross the Hindu Kush, but he couldn't sit still in a palace without feeling like he was failing. Ecology of Obsession teaches us that if you don't define what enough looks like, the world will eventually define it for you, usually with a dead end. Alexander didn't just run out of map, he ran out of himself. The question isn't whether you have the potential to achieve greatness. The question is, what is left of you once you reach it? Thank you for being part of the Emperor Mind community. Keep sharpening your perspective. Until next time.